The Second Crusade has failed, but its end will open the door to the Plantagenets, that brilliant, avaricious, rebellious, murderous family that will dominate the history of Western Europe for a century to come. Here's their story, so riveting that we still are fascinated by it 900 years later.
Welcome back to Lion's Forge. My name is Beckett, and I want to tell you a story. An epic, true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 2, Episode 12. Life does not remain the same. We think of time so long past as unchangingly gray, generation after generation. But it's not true. Life in the 12th century was changing, from castles to carrots. For centuries, castles had been valued solely in terms of their dominating power. But people now were beginning to boast of familial strongholds for their beauty as well as their brawny force. Things like indoor water pumped through wooden pipes, wavery but clear window glass, and refined marble floors were increasingly available to and desired by the wealthy. There were manicured landscapes of artificial pools, orchards, specimen trees, ornamental pavilions, grazing deer, and pet swans. Chronicler Gerald of Wales preened openly when he called his family's castle the most beautiful in Wales, and wrote approvingly of the Bishop of Lincoln's palace as elegantly surrounded by woods and ponds. As for carrots, they were an admired sensation on wealthy tables, prized for their sweet flavor, so different from the dully monotonous winter supply of ordinary root vegetables, and for their lovely purple color, so different from our own belief that carrots are, by definition, orange. Eleanor's court, like so many other legends about the lady, was long rumored to be even more enticing than its rivals, because it was supposedly, and perhaps enviously, purported to be a court of love, where beautiful, laughing women decided which supplicant knight deserved a lady's favor, sometimes sexual, sometimes not. Alas, like so many legends associated with Eleanor, it's probably not true. But it is true that men and women living in her world were beginning to reconsider what embodied desirable behavior. Was it still enough just to swing a big heavy sword? Or were there, perhaps, other better, more enjoyable ways to live? We can make out at least some shadows of Eleanor's involvement in this new thinking. After all, 50 years before, her grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, had been one of the very first Europeans we know of to muse openly on new ways of approaching life. When Eleanor in turn was in Poitiers as a grown woman, this new thinking, collectively called courtoisie, still needed a decade or two to fully mature. But it seems logical that many of those thinking, talking, and writing about the new ideas knew of her family's hospitality to new ideas, and were welcomed at her palace gates. It was long believed that Eleanor was a literal troubadour patron, but modern historians are less supportive. Yet Eleanor certainly had many of the characteristics of someone who would be interested in and open to such visitors. So even if not as involved in their world as earlier and more romantic biographers have believed, it seems unlikely that she had no interaction with them at all. What we now would call gallantry is usually associated with romantic behavior, perhaps becoming outdated in turn in our own day, but in Eleanor's time it meant a new sensibility of moderation in all things, from ardor to military aggression. It was no longer enough to be a big guy with a fist. The fist was now to be connected to a rational and classically educated brain. This new respect for moderation, for thinking and acting as an adult rather than a hot-headed adolescent, was moving fitfully into the broader consciousness, and we can thank the troubadours for it. Who were they? Many were either aristocrats themselves or respected friends of aristocrats, which meant they were educated, welcome at the best tables, and possessed of the means, unusual at the time, to move freely from place to place. They were poets and musicians, best-selling authors, creators of fictional characters we still recognize, artists who distilled anything and everything they saw into their work, racing to make a name for themselves ahead of the competition. Originality wasn't prized as we prize it now. The ideal of the day was to be one of the educated elite, capable of passing ancient texts forward, inventive with already recognized themes and characters. Roman myths of gods and goddesses in love and in lust, mystical Celtic stories of times already long past, legends of the brave days of King Arthur, gossip about the behavior of upper-class fashionistas of the day, all were grist for the troubadour mill. People so preoccupied with war as our medieval friends were naturally enthusiastic about battle epics, those proud retellings of heroic deeds. But new thinking began to steer the violent old stories in new directions. How characters thought and spoke gradually became more important than raw action. Women joined the cast, vehicles to express love and longing. Some troubadours played to the eternal human belief in a lost golden era, back when elegance, civility, wisdom, and care for the common people were the happy norm, unlike the degraded standards now sadly all too common. One poet of the time wrote wistfully, "Where are the gracious welcomes of those days?" causing one to soberly consider what 10th century hospitality must have been like. Sexual intrigue was always irresistible. Lovers were constantly forced to part at dawn's light after a marvelous night in each other's arms, because spouses would, sadly, turn up any minute. Traveling everywhere, observing the best and worst of the upper class, the troubadours were the society reporters of their day. Observant, clever, impudent, they fed on the curiosity and rivalry among male aristocrats. Their witty assessments of various courts came to define what society newly aspired to be, where the virtues of hospitality, generosity, and affability were seen as marks of status and cultivated taste. But the troubadours weren't mere reporters. They were the culture's novelists and screenwriters, capable of spinning Bible stories, folk tales, Aesop's fables, lives of the saints, Greek myths, and real history into something vibrantly new. They developed fictional characters still quite recognizable almost 1,000 years later. King Arthur, a relatively minor historical figure in reality, is probably the most famous troubadour invention. Another is the wizard Merlin, who had first seen the light of day generations before Eleanor's era as an evil Welsh fairy. Troubadours were also quite keen on women, whom they viewed as the source of whatever beauty, refinement, grace, and enjoyable conversation were to be found at what one described with scorn as the boring and vulgar courts overrun by men. Remember that at the time, the church and society at large still regarded females as prime causes of trouble in the world, sinful daughters of the original sinner, Eve. Conventional thinking had it that women were silly, lazy, vain, weak, and obsessed with sex. A frequent character in popular medieval stories is the female bawd, most famously the peasant woman who, given her choice of wishes, opted to have her husband equipped with extra pricks all over his body. The Greek and Roman classics so admired by our refined upper-class medieval friends weren't all that much better, treating women as silly little creatures, pliable as tissue. Beloved Ovid, widely read, viewed females as mere objects of ready seduction by some dominant male. However, Eleanor and her peers were beginning to scoff at Ovid's thinking. They were every bit as likely to seduce as to be seduced, an idea readily associated with Eleanor herself. The wildly popular story in Eleanor's day of the doomed, passionate, adulterous lovers Tristan and Isolde presented Tristan as the era's beau ideal of masculinity. A combination of courageous warrior, thoughtful diplomat, friend of the common man, brilliant debater, talented harpist, and sensitive poet, not to mention soulful lover. Even today, we'd consider him one very highly tuned instrument. This manly paragon was the target of sophisticated, strong-willed Isolde's passion rather than the other way around, a telling assessment of the true mental state of supposedly docile 12th century ladies. One social advisor of the day felt that the only way out for the besieged male was to pretend to be ill. Given the hours they spent in their chambers, it's not hard to understand why women were a prime audience for authors of the day. Troubadour works with vivid heroines accordingly began to compete vigorously with the old battle epics and lives of the saints, taking what we'd call popular fiction off in a direction that's endured for the better part of 9 centuries. This new style was not entirely applauded. For one thing, the church held the strong belief that blatantly sexual themes were a source of sin. Then, too, this new popular culture started to elbow the established writing class aside. An English monk named Denis Pyramus, author of a long poem on the life of Edmund the Martyr, which he evidently feared might not enjoy the esteem he hoped for, groused about the female troubadour Marie de France, complaining that her romantic writings were not at all true, but were enthusiastically received by women and even by men who ought to know better. The chronicler Peter of Blois was annoyed that people could sit dry-eyed through the retelling of the crucifixion at Mass, but went home to weep buckets over the tragic romance of Arthur and Guinevere. As for the male Plantagenets, they were genuinely taken with legendary King Arthur. In real life, the king of the mythical Round Table seems to have been a Celtic battle chieftain back in the 6th century, successful for a remarkably long time in fending off barbarians. One historian of our day describes him as a mighty English warrior king who won 12 terrible battles against Saxon invaders up until the day one finally killed him. Despite his sad ending, Arthur has had genuine staying power, becoming entwined over generations with other folk stories of long-dead heroes and their great deeds. In Henry's time, an aristocratic churchman named Geoffrey de Monmouth wrote one of the age's best sellers, the Historia Regum Britanniae, which recast a number of old legends, including Arthur, to populate his stories of Britain's earliest days. According to inventive Geoffrey, Arthur conquered not just the Saxons looting his native Wessex, but also knocked out the Picts, the Scots, and the inhabitants of France, Scandinavia, and Iceland before marrying Guinevere, not just a beauty, but a direct descendant of ancient Roman nobility. This burnished image was taken up another notch when another eager author, known to us simply as Wace, adapted Monmouth's story into a very long French poem called the Roman de Bru. Here Arthur, already a brilliant fighting man and legendary lover, is raised to the level of thoughtful, measured king. One who met with his men around a democratically round table and resisted war unless it was the only possible way to bring peace to his grateful people. Even better, it was widely thought, or perhaps more accurately hoped, that Arthur would eventually return to bring his enlightened sensibility back to an anxiously awaiting world. Little surprise that Henry, and then his son Richard Lionheart, not enthusiastic about rivals, even those returning from the dead, were intent on proving that Arthur in fact was quite deceased, launching a well-publicized search for the ancient grave, a royal obsession that went on for years. When it was jubilantly announced to have been found at last, it just happened to lie near Glastonbury Abbey, well known as a Plantagenet benefice, suddenly able to tout a stellar pilgrimage attraction. The grave, remarkably untouched by time or weather despite centuries of both, was said to contain a tall, broad-shouldered male and a stately woman still attached to a full head of golden hair. These evidently regal corpses were accompanied by a metal plate helpfully inscribed, "Here lies King Arthur, buried with Guinevere." No surprise that archaeologist Max Adam describes this wondrous discovery as a deliberate forgery, concocted by Glastonbury monks in a bid to recover their prestige and economic fortunes after a disastrous fire at the abbey. We don't know how much influence wealthy, famous Eleanor had on all of this, since cautious scholars of our day are far less willing than their predecessors to give her credit. Many works once linked to her are now thought doubtful, although we can clearly see her in some stories of the day. Take The Jealous King, Outspoken Queen, Rival Lover and Travels to Constantinople and Jerusalem presented, author's tongue firmly in cheek, as The Pilgrimage of Charlemagne. Another immense epic poem about the Trojan War, all 40,000 lines of it, was undoubtedly dedicated to Eleanor, although the dedication speaks only of the grand wife of a grand king. There is also the legend, delightful if now sadly discounted, that she was the subject of a popular medieval street rhyme that went, "Were the lands all mine from the Elbe to the Rhine, I'd count them with little case, if yet the Queen of England would lie in my embrace." We have to leave the lady and her household in Poitiers, that ancient city basking on its plateau embraced by rivers, where her grandfather wrote such fresh poetry and raised such fresh hell, where her grandmothers were warrior queens and infamous seductresses. It could have been such a charming place in those years before the troubles took hold. She has her household, her vassals, her ministers, emissaries from other courts, visiting churchmen, friends. Gifts arrive, an inlaid ivory comb, a young falcon ready for its training, a new book, figs in a basket, wine. Musicians try out new ideas on their guitars and flute-like recorders. A golden sun shines in the blue summer sky. Wine grapes ripen. Hawks soar to heaven. Winter rains invite people to sit close to welcoming fires. The chess table is readied. The resident tribe of cooks and their slaving assistants labor over the prandium, the main meal, anticipated with enthusiasm around 1 o'clock every afternoon. Roast beef, boiled pork with sauces, boiled eggs, baked game birds, cheese, bread and biscuits, purple-hued carrots, lettuce, the novel and expensive onion, nuts, fruits we'd recognize in their seasons, jellies, quite a bit of wine, then custards, cakes, or prized grapes to finish. Someone sings in another room, accompanied by a very fashionable harpist. A lady, perhaps Eleanor herself, is greeted with applause for a new scarlet gown embellished with gold, entirely of the moment with its stylish long train, flowing sleeves, and deeply slashed panels allowing the green lining to flash as she walks. Her embroidered shoes with their carved heels would be particularly admired, not to mention envied, since access to the world's best shoemakers was as prized then as it is today. There may be occasional spasms of jealousy over Rosamund Clifford, but on the whole, Eleanor is probably happy. Her husband, once loved by her, still commands the stage. With few exceptions, she simply would choose not to watch. As for Henry, by now in his mid-30s and deep into his romance with Rosamund, he had begun to contemplate the inheritances of his 3 older boys, the Princes Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, themselves 14, 12, and 11 at the time, with baby John trailing in the rear. Given Henry's age and theirs, no one is quite sure what drove Henry's sudden interest. Some historians think he admired the French tradition of crowning a young prince as the acknowledged royal successor, which hopefully staved off later wars for dominance. If young Henry were to be crowned King of England, for example, the younger Plantagenets would owe him homage, with its attendant loyalties. Such a clarifying prospect. Historian Frank McLynn thinks Henry contemplated going on crusade, that notoriously dangerous undertaking, a powerful incentive to think through inheritance issues. John Gillingham credits Henry with simply beginning to realize that he would have to find some way to divide his empire among his numerous sons. Matthew Strickland is of the opinion that Henry had vivid memories of what happened to his predecessor, Stephen of Blois, when Stephen failed to set a crown on his son Eustace's head in time, a mistake which deprived the House of Blois-Champagne of the English throne. Given his 4 living legitimate sons, working things out to please all parties would seem tricky, even with all of Henry's intelligence and cunning. As Abraham Lincoln once famously remarked about the apparently infinite number of job seekers hounding him for a finite number of jobs, there are too many pigs for the tits. This was an era when any noble family's collective interest trumped the individuals in it. Younger brothers routinely, if grudgingly, and not always reliably, accepted their second-string destinies to keep family wealth concentrated in the hands of the oldest son. Yet, there was a competing custom, well known among the Normans, that younger sons were supposed to get something from their father, even if the bulk of the family's fortune went to the oldest. Henry certainly possessed enough to settle each of his boys. Henry's own personal inheritance of England with its royal title, plus his lands of Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, would go to his eldest, Prince Henry. Eleanor's Aquitaine, her own inheritance, was for her favorite, Richard, while Brittany could be Geoffrey's, a promise sealed by his engagement to 7-year-old Constance, blood heiress to the duchy. To maintain cordial Plantagenet ties with the Capetians, even while Henry rarely missed a chance to threaten Capetian borders, Richard would be betrothed to a French princess, little Elise, much as his older brothers had been pledged to Elise's sister, Marguerite. The one left behind, John, would need what every landless youngest boy needed, an heiress of his own. But this was a problem for another day. Louis Capet was supposed to bless any such arrangement Henry crafted, given that Plantagenet lands and titles on the continent were held as a vassal of the King of France. Louis, nearly 50 himself, but fortified with a son at last, continued in his role of Henry's sometimes friend, constant rival. He had happily lent his protection to Thomas Becket for 6 years by now, and fought endless skirmishes with the Plantagenets over their lands in France, the exact borders of their lands in France, and the loyalty of their vassals in France. This was not exactly a small issue. One historian writes that more than 40 villages were torched on the French-Norman border just in the single year 1168. The two kings might cautiously avoid pitched warfare, but they remorselessly kept up the pressure. Still, blessed with only one heir of his own to worry about and one roughly united kingdom to give him, Louis was amenable to Henry's proposal that the continental Plantagenet lands would be fractioned off. He sealed his assent by sending his daughter, 9-year-old Elise, to the Plantagenets as the future bride for Prince Richard. This little fiancée, brought out from Louis's stable of girls, was the infant whose teenage mother, Louis's short-lived second wife, had died giving birth to her. In later years, this affable diplomatic deal would make Elise's life hell, but at present all that anyone saw was the promise she held in her small body. If she and Richard lived to maturity and had male children who lived, she could be the key to control of France. Of course, those male children of a future time also increased the prospect of intensified rivalry among his sons, and all while Henry himself was only 35. Whether or not this self-evident problem occurred to Henry, as we'll see, he pursued his plan of settling his sons' inheritances with feverish enthusiasm. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Becket Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author Karen Markle-Knabb. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again May 13th for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.